and welcome to episode 28 of the Detours in Music podcast. My name is Laura Rupel, and today we have an interview with Professor of Saxophone at James Madison University, Dave Pope. Hope you enjoy.
Hello, my name is David Pope. I am Professor of Saxophone at James Madison University.
Perfect. And can you talk about your start in music?
Sure. I was always interested in music, and I think that one of the big one of the things in my childhood that was really influential was watching all the great PBS kids shows. So I grew up in the 70s on Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and Electric Company. So I was immediately exposed to, and in those programs, music and musicians were always front and center. Always. So I was always singing. My mom also played the radio a lot because I think fortunately for those of us that grew up before entertainment was streaming and constant, you watch Sesame Street when it was on, and then it wasn't on anymore, and then you didn't have a constant stream of entertainment, so the radio was on a lot. And my mom also played a lot of records, so it was kind of a mix of classical music and Frank Sinatra records. She had like one or two jazz records, but it was a mixture of stuff. So I listened to a lot of different kinds of music, and I remember two things that I really remember from my childhood that had a big impact on me. The first was, and this is funny because I didn't really think about it until much later, when I was in my career. But I remember on Sesame Street, the great jazz singer Lena Horne sang the ABC song, which seems like just sort of a sure, she's singing the ABC song, but it was like a funky kind of a soul band backup, and she sang it very syncopated and very stylized, and I didn't know what that was, but I knew that to me was something really special. That really sparked my interest in the way that she phrased it. And then later I connected that with the way that Frank Sinatra sang. The other thing that had a huge impact on me was my mom had a copy of Heifetz, the Heifetz RCA Living Stereo record of the Tchaikovsky Concerto with Reiner conducting, and that was my first exposure to true virtuosity. And again, I didn't know why I was so excited by that recording, but I would listen to it all the time. And as soon as I was old enough to put the record on the record player and get the needle on without without scratching the thing, I listened to that record all the time. So I wanted to play violin.
Okay.
But I came from a very blue collar family. I was the first in my family to go to college. My dad was a machinist and a welder, and he became a maintenance engineer at a couple of factories. And my mom was a licensed practical nurse, and she became partially disabled from meningitis infection when I was a kid. So there wasn't a lot of money. I mean, I grew up well, but there wasn't a lot of money. And so, I wanted to play violin, but they just couldn't seem to get me a violin. So then I wanted to learn to play piano, but we didn't have a piano, so I couldn't get piano lessons because, at that time, you were required to own an acoustic piano. But they did get me an inexpensive electric organ.
Okay.
And a bunch of these, and this is, this is from another time, but these were songbooks where the music was written out, and then there was a color code over all the notes, and then the colors were on the keyboard, so you could match the colors, sort of like paint by number, except with music. And so I learned a lot of these songs. Like there was a book of songs from the Roaring '20s, and Bicycle Built for Two, those kinds of things. And so I started to piece together, what music looked like and what it sounded like. So I sang in church choir. I was always really interested in sound, independently actually of music. Like I was that weird kid that loved the sound of the air conditioner and the vacuum cleaner, like I heard the overtones, I was fascinated by that stuff. I loved the sound of my dad's old tube amp when you would turn it off and the thing would sort of hum and then wind down. I thought that was super cool. but I didn't really have any proper training. I just listened to a lot of music, and I played along with this organ. And then in the fourth grade, my elementary school program had a really terrible instrumental program at the time. Fortunately, it's been fixed now, and it's actually a wonderful program. I grew up in Massachusetts.
Okay.
So you had a choice. You could play flute, trumpet, or clarinet. And I had like all the orthodonture stuff that you could have. I had like braces and headgear, and so the only instrument that I could play out of that was the flute, because you could get the flute in there. You didn't have to put it in your mouth or so. And I didn't really want to play the flute, but that was the only instrument that was presented. I'm going to play the flute, and I was very interested in making sounds on the flute, and I was in the band for the fourth grade, and then in the fifth grade, we would have group lessons with the teacher, and I was playing with the flute, and I had discovered one of the jazz records my mom had was a Herbie Mann record, who was this jazz flute player who also played bamboo flute, wood flutes and things, and I discovered that if you like fingered like a G or an F and then you added the side keys, you could get this sound that sounded like a wood flute. And I thought it was really cool. And I was showing it to, I'm sure I was disrupting the class, but I was showing the person next to me, this thing that I had learned to do. And the teacher scolded me and said, we never use those keys. And I was like, what? And I was that kid that if you said, don't press that button, all I thought about night and day was pressing that button, So I never went back to band class after that, and my parents didn't know.
Yeah.
and they were renting the flute, and they kept asking me, when is the concert, and I kept saying, oh, it's been postponed, and then they finally found out. My dad whipped my behind with a belt, and it was a scene. But they recognized that even though I hadn't been to band class in like 2 months, but I was still practicing every day, and what I had done is I was taking the organ books, and I was practicing these songs out of the organ book, and I had the little kitchen timer, and I would do my half hour every day. So my parents made a deal with me that they would continue to rent the flute as long as I continued to practice. And I was like, great, because I knew that the band sounded really bad, and it was not a positive experience for me. And the moment that the teacher said, well, we never use those keys, I lost all respect for him. I was just like, that cannot be right.
Yeah.
So then it was in the seventh grade, and I got a call to the principal's office. This was our middle school was seventh and eighth grade.
Okay.
And to my horror, my mom is standing in the office with my flute and the principal, and they tell me, you're going to be in band. You have to try it for a month. And if you don't like it, you can quit it after a month, but we want you to do it for a month. And, I was crying, and, Mom, I'm going to kill you. It was the worst. So and literally from there, I had, with my flute, walked into band rehearsal, which had already started, and, I didn't know anybody, and I was last chair flute. It was terrible. But the teacher was wonderful. And like, I immediately connected with, wow, this is somebody who actually like really knows what he's doing. And, in very short order, I saw him pick up the flute and play the flute, because he was a flutist. And then he picks up a trombone and he plays a trombone. And that blew my mind. I thought, how can you play the flute and the trombone? That's impossible. This guy must be a god. So that became a positive experience for me. And then in the seventh grade winter concert, we shared our concert with the high school.
Okay.
And that was when I saw that the girls that played flute, and of course I was paying attention to the girls, right? I was a seventh grader, but the girls that played flute in the concert band played saxophone in the jazz band. And my head exploded. And, that literally after that concert, I went to the band director and said, I want to play the saxophone. I want to play the saxophone. I want to play the saxophone. He's like, okay. And, I kept at it, and I kept nagging him. And then finally that summer, he gave me a saxophone.
Yeah.
And once I started playing the saxophone, that was it. There was no stopping me.
Yeah.
I knew by the time I was 14 that I was going to make my living playing the saxophone.
That's awesome. I can relate in a little bit of really begging to play the instrument that you end up playing. I had to ask my middle school band director for like a whole semester if I could play oboe, and he was like, no, that that will be horrible. So I think it was Marlon Foster, and I'm sure he just knew that he didn't want
Uh-huh.
an oboe in the sixth grade band, which is not a bad idea.
Right, right.
And then after a semester over Christmas break, he gave me a reed, which really doesn't do anything, but that was like enough to get me so excited. And then in January of the next semester, I got like the oboe that had like 5 keys on it. So um,
Right.
yeah, it's funny sometimes to look back and be like, hey, you didn't even want me to play this.
Well, and I think it's funny how when we find the right fit, that's just it. It
Mm-hmm.
happens. When the fit is right. Because I knew that I was not a pianist. I knew that I was not a flutist.
Mm-hmm.
Even now, I play a lot of different instruments, but saxophone is the instrument that I really connect with the most.
Yeah, awesome. So going into high school, was music just like the only focus, or was there anything else you were considering?
Yeah, I hated school.
Mm-hmm.
I hated school. It wasn't that I hated studying. I actually I was very interested in science. Physics was one of my favorite classes. I think that maybe I would have been interested in science if I wasn't going into music, except that I was slow at math, and the being slow at math was frustrating.
Yeah.
When I started to get into the higher levels of things. But all my friends, I had a hard time making friends when I was a kid because I was very intense, and I tended to exhaust people with, I'd be very fascinated with one thing and I just wanted to talk about that one thing. And,
Mhm.
I would burn through friends pretty quickly. But when I started playing music, that was a way to connect with people where we all sort of shared this intensity.
Yeah.
And, I think it's the nature of the activity. So all my friends were musicians, and I was very, very focused on music.
That's
I had
awesome.
I had a deal with the neighbors in our neighborhood that I could practice until 10 p.m. That was when I had to stop, and I would practice every night until 9:59 and 59 seconds. Like as soon as the clock would, then I would stop. And I was always frustrated that I had to stop.
Yeah. How did that translate into you pursuing a Bachelor of Music?
Well, I grew up in a suburb near Boston.
Okay.
And so I thought that I was going to go to, my initial plan was I was going to go to the Berkeley School of Music, which is now the Berkeley College, but back then it was just a school. And I wasn't even really necessarily thinking about getting a degree so much as I was going to go to this school and study with like Joe Viola, or one of the great maybe like Branford Marsalis or somebody, and from there I was going to either move to Boston or move to New York and be a professional performer.
Hmm.
um, but as a senior in high school, I made and I was a late bloomer in terms of having success in like the district and all state band things. So
Okay.
I never made a district band until my junior year of high school. In my junior year of high school, I made the district concert band, and then I made the all state concert band, and that was a unbelievable experience for me because the director of the all state band that year was John Painter, who was the founder of the Northwestern band program.
Okay.
And I remember we played. I don't remember anything that we played except we played Fennell's transcription of Elsa's Procession to the Cathedral.
Okay.
And I remember it, in the rehearsal playing, and like the tears are running down my cheeks and I'm embarrassed, and I look next to me and I see that the person next to me is crying.
Hmm.
And suddenly I realize everybody's crying and all the band directors are lined up on the wall and they're crying, and that for me was like the moment where I knew that playing playing band was more, there was more to
Hmm.
it.
Yeah.
Um, but as a senior, I made the district jazz band, and then I made the all-state jazz band. And the director of both my district and all-state band was Jeff Holmes, who's the director of the jazz program at University of Massachusetts.
Okay.
And he basically, in the course of those rehearsals, recruited me to go to UMass.
Hmm.
And I didn't really like it. It wasn't really on my radar as something that I was going to do. I thought I was going to go to like a, kind of like a trade school conservatory and learn how to play and then go be a performer. Um, and I wasn't super excited about like taking gen eds and, you know, doing a full, you know, a full bachelor's degree like that. But I really liked Jeff Holmes. And then I went to the university and I met Lynn Klock, who's the saxophone teacher. And I instantly loved him. And, you know, he's become, I mean, I still talk to him, you know, I mean, I that was 30 years ago, and I still talk to him at least once a month, you know. Um, and it happened it happened really quickly, you know, because it was probably like November.
Okay.
And I had only applied to Berkeley, and I figured I was going to go to Berkeley. And at that time, you know, basically, if you had a checking account, you got into Berkeley. You know, that's sort of the way that it worked.
Okay.
So I didn't really know what was up, except that I had to apply to the University of Massachusetts, and I got a small scholarship, and so that's where I went.
Awesome. And that ended up being like the perfect place for you, do you think?
Oh, I mean, so perfect. I can't even imagine what would have happened to me if I had gone somewhere else. I mean, it perfectly set me up for what I was going to end up doing with my career. Even though I, you know, talking about detours, you know, I think my entire career has been a series of detours that were unexpected.
Yeah.
Because initially I thought I was going to get my Bachelor of Music, and then I was going to move to New York and be a professional jazz player, or maybe a woodwind doubler. Because at that time I was playing a lot of flute and clarinet, and I was playing some musical theater, you know, that kind of stuff. But I fell in love with teaching. And I think part of falling in love with teaching was that I had these incredible teachers. You know, I was studying jazz with Jeff Holmes, and I was studying classical saxophone with Lynn Klock. And then I don't really know what I was studying, because I was taking lessons with Yusef Latif, who was also on the faculty. And he didn't like the word jazz, and he didn't like the word improvisation. It was more, he called it autophysio-psychic music, you know, which is this, you know, it's a mouthful to say, but essentially he was teaching the performer, composer, improviser paradigm.
Okay.
You know, and that had a tremendous on me. It made me think about what it meant to be an artist. So like I was getting all these great jazz performance and writing skills from Jeff, and Yusef was teaching me to be an artist, and Lynn Klock was teaching me to be a great musician, you know. So from there, I decided that the natural thing would be to become a professor of jazz studies. So from there, I went to the Eastman School of Music, and I did a master's degree in jazz comp and arranging.
Okay.
And the idea is that I was going to be like, you know, I was going to be the Chuck Dotis of, you know, of whatever, you know, program I could teach at. But I also knew at that time that I wanted to teach at a large public comprehensive university, because over time, the experience that I had with the liberal arts background really had a big impact on who I became as an artist, which at the time, you know, I was like, oh, I got to take these classes.
Yeah.
But a few of those classes really had a heavy, lasting impact on the way that I think about the world, the way that I think about the world. So I thought that was it, you know. And I was really lucky, because I also, as an undergraduate, I accidentally stumbled into a professional writing job with the magazine Saxophone Journal.
Okay.
So I started reviewing CDs for them when I was a senior at UMass, which was totally amazing. You know, that I was still a student and I had this opportunity to write. And then I only did that for a brief moment, and then the guy that wrote the jazz improvisation article moved over to a different magazine. So I was offered that column, and I ended up writing for 20 years for Saxophone Journal, which was amazing.
Incredible. Yeah.
It was just amazing, you know. And in the beginning, you know, before email became so ubiquitous, I would get letters from people all over the world would send me transcriptions of a solo that they did, or they would send me a CD, or I have like a folder in my file cabinet of just somebody from Australia wrote to me, somebody from Brazil wrote to me, and I was still a kid. I barely knew what I was doing. So I had that going at the same time as I was in school, and I got the master's degree, and I applied for a whole bunch of professor jobs, and nothing. I got one job, checked my references, but I never heard from them. So I was really depressed because at that point I had made a CD on a label, and I had this experience writing for the Saxophone magazine.
Mm-hmm.
I had a bachelor's degree from UMass, and I had a master's degree from the Eastman School of Music, and I couldn't get a job.
Yeah.
So this for me was where I took a class at Eastman from Ray Ricker that at that time was called Entrepreneurship in Music, and in some ways Ray kind of invented this idea in academia. He has a really a wonderful book that's called what is it called? It's called like the Street Smart Music Professor, or something like that. I forget what the name of it is, but it's really quite good. So one of Ray's things, and this was an assignment for everybody in the class, is that you had to make a 5-year plan.
Mm-hmm.
And the 5-year plan was like, it had to be really detailed, and it worked kind of like a flow chart. So you started where you were, and then you had like at the end of the chart, your goal, where you wanted to be, but you also had to have levels of goals. So for me, my top goal at that time was I wanted to be a professor of jazz studies at a large public comprehensive university. And then it was sort of, well, maybe I'll be an adjunct at a smaller school, or maybe I'll be freelancing and, teaching a class here and there, or maybe I'll be, workshopping high school bands and teaching privately.
Mm-hmm.
So I ended up, after I graduated, and first I was really depressed, and I probably spent a couple of weeks sitting on the couch eating potato chips and crying that things hadn't worked out. And then I remembered, I have a plan. I have a plan. I should stick to the plan. And so at so the sort of the top tier is everything going right in the flow
Mm-hmm.
chart, and and then you sort of work your way down. And so I looked at the things that I could do that opened the most doors, and decided to do all those things. So for me, that meant I played every gig that I could get. I was a yes man. If you
Mm-hmm.
called me and asked me to play, yes, I played everything. So I was playing in a wedding band that was like a big production band
Okay.
that had multiple singers, and we would do like a jazz dinner set, and then we would do top 40 and classic rock and that kind of stuff. And so I was probably playing at least 1 or 2 weddings a week for 3 years.
Wow.
And yeah, I mean, it helped way through school, really.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I was doing that, and I had my own jazz group, and I played in a rehearsal band, big band that paid, $5 and a beer, but it was a great networking experience. And actually one of the things that happened from that experience, which was it's a great illustration of why it's important to say yes when you're young.
Mm-hmm.
The second alto player was out, and so the sub in the band that week was the band director at a really great high school in upstate New York. This was in Rochester. I stayed in Rochester, and he was just sort of talking at the bar about how he has this composer in residence program he does at his high school, and he didn't have anybody yet. And then he turns, and there I am sitting next to him at the bar.
Mm-hmm.
And he knew of my work at Eastman because he had come and heard the concerts, and he knew my writing, and he gave me the gig. And that meant I got $1,500, and I got to the exposure of working with the kids, and
Mm-hmm.
it was really a wonderful experience.
Yeah.
So in the process of doing that, I also had a big private studio, and my classical students, and I didn't play any classical saxophone for 2 years when I was at Eastman, because I didn't have time, because I was between playing in the Eastman Jazz Ensemble and being a writing major.
Mm-hmm.
There was just no time for anything else. I mean, I was practicing probably 5 hours a day, and I was staying up all night writing, probably 3 or 4 nights a week. It was insanity. But I missed playing classical saxophone. And so the year that I took off after the master's degree, my involuntary, year off, I joined a classical saxophone quartet.
Okay.
And we booked a concert at the George Eastman House, which is the museum where George Eastman lived. So I was doing that, and I was teaching private students. And one of my classical students made the New York All-State Band, which is really, you can imagine, New York is extremely competitive. Mm-hmm. So when that happened, suddenly my phone is ringing, and people are asking me, do you have room in your studio for, another classical saxophone student? And very quickly, I realized that the thing that I was looking forward to the most in my week was teaching these classical students, which wasn't what I expected at all.
Yeah.
So then I called Lynn Clark and I said, I think I want to be a studio saxophone teacher. And so he basically said, go get a pencil and some paper. And I did. And he laid it all out for me. He said, this is what you're going to have to do. And this was right at the time too that saxophonists were starting to get doctorates.
Okay.
Because that was, saxophone is comparatively new in the conservatory. So really, there was a huge wave of hiring of saxophone professors in the 80s. Mm-hmm. And a lot of those folks didn't have doctorates because there weren't that many doctorates available for saxophonists. So Lynn told me, you got to go start a doctorate somewhere. You have to do it someplace where you're not going to have to pay because you can't get into any more debt than you're already in. Mm-hmm. And you got to go someplace where you're going to be, and this was the important part, he said, you have to be the instructor of record to saxophone majors. Mm-hmm. And if you're not going to be the instructor of record, if you're not going to appear on the transcript as their teacher, then it's no good. Wait to find another program. And so, I looked at, I was very organized. I made index cards for all the saxophone professors that had a job that I would like. Mm-hmm. So I looked at all like the flagship schools in the different states, and I made notes about where they got their degrees, what their experience was, and I started sort of collating them to figure out, what's the best strategy here. Yeah. Because I Jen and I got married right after I graduated at UMass.
Okay.
So, and she's 2 years older than me, so she had already graduated, and so I was very highly motivated to get on with my career, because we were in kind of a holding pattern, until we figured out what to do. And luckily Jen was very experienced in library science. So everywhere that we went, like when we went to Eastman, she got a job at Nazareth College working at the library right away. Mm. So then looking at all the different schools, I saw that University of Miami was a good place to go. And then it just so happened that the graduating doctoral student was a UMass grad and was one of Lynn Clark's students. So that was kind of a way in, because they had already learned to, because George Wormchuk, he teaches at University of Central Florida. He was their first classical doctoral saxophone student. So there was already like an establishment of trust there. Mm-hmm. So I ended up going there, and I got an assistantship in the jazz program, but they hired me to be an adjunct classical saxophone teacher. So it was just the perfect combination of things. Yeah. And I did that for a year, and I got an email from my professor at Eastman who said, a guy named Chuck Dotis is going to call you. Yeah. And there's going to be a 1-year temporary position in saxophone at this school, James Madison University. And I'd never heard of James Madison University before, to be honest. And my teacher, Fred Sturm, said, don't apply for the 1-year job. He said, you need to stay at University of Miami for another year, but here's what you're going to do. I had just these incredible mentors, they really set me up for success. So Fred said, even if you have to take a student loan, take a course overload from now on, so that you have all your coursework done in 2 years. And then apply when after the 1-year job is happening, there's going to be a full tenured tenure track search.
Yeah.
You're going to apply for that job, and then you're going to win that job. And I said, okay, yes, Fred. And I wrote it down, and that's exactly what I did.
Yeah.
And I remember, and I was not the first pick of the search committee. They brought in two people before me, and I kind of had given up hope on it. I thought, and I thought, well, I don't have any full-time teaching experience, and that job is probably a little too high of a goal for me at this time. And then I was teaching a lesson in my professor's office, and he walks in and interrupts the lesson and says, "There's a phone call for you in the office. It's James Madison University." And I went in, and it was Sue Baylor,
Right.
our beloved old secretary, and that was it. I was invited to come down and interview, and I remember when I got to JMU,
Mm-hmm.
I was really surprised because I didn't know how big it was or
Mm-hmm.
how beautiful it was going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought I had absolutely no chance of winning the job. So I think in some ways I was actually really kind of relaxed when I took the interview, because I thought,
Yeah.
well, there's no chance. This is just a really
Yeah.
great opportunity for me to practice.
Mm-hmm.
And Chuck and I immediately connected. I mean, we had a lot of shared experiences, and
Yeah.
aesthetically about music, we had a lot of things in common. And I was immediately offered the job. I couldn't believe it.
Wow.
And that was 20 years ago.
That's great. I think a lot of people have had very similar stories about when they came to interview. It's like, well, hadn't heard of it, but then I found it and I really wanted it, and then it worked out. So, I'm happy. So,
Yeah. And I remember when I got back to University of Miami, I got off the airplane and went back to my apartment, and then I had to go straight to a wind ensemble recording session. And two of the trumpet players in the wind ensemble were JMU grads, and one was actually Brian Balmage's.
okay.
So I sat down, and Gary Green made the announcement to everybody that I had won the job, and everybody cheered. And then Brian starts playing the JMU fight song, and which I didn't know what that was at the time, but he was like, "Don't worry, you're going to hear it a lot,"
Funny. Wow. I guess looking back, what's something that you struggled with in your undergraduate degree?
Um, I struggled with mental health, I think, and I think that part of it was that I had kind of a warped perception of what you were supposed to be as an artist. And so I had convinced myself that in order to be an artist, you had to be this tortured, twisted, figure.
Mm-hmm.
So I imagined myself as, I had to be like Beethoven, or I had to be like, some of these jazz musicians that,
Mm-hmm.
you know, dark.
Yeah.
It was dark. And I practiced much harder than I probably should have.
Mm.
At that time I was practicing 6 hours a day in the week, and I was practicing 8 hours a day on the weekend. And I basically, I gave myself tendinitis to the point where I had to stop playing for a little while so that I could recover.
Mm-hmm.
I had to relearn my technique. For a while I thought I was going to have to quit, because I was in constant pain. It was a long, slow creep,
Mm-hmm.
of injury. But I didn't realize that at the same time that I was injuring myself physically, I was injuring myself mentally.
Yeah.
And as I started to figure out, that you don't have to be perfect, and that um, you don't have to be any particular thing. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I really had convinced myself that you couldn't be smiley, happy, friendly jazz musician. Like, I had just convinced myself that that's not what it is to
Yeah.
be. And then, as I sort of came out of that and realized, you know and this is a really important thing, and I think that I've talked about this, when we played the Coalgrass.
Mm.
Michael's philosophy, which had a very big impact on me, is that what you do and who you are separate things. And by defining who you are as however good your last concert was, or
Mhm.
however successful your last practice session was, is a recipe for disaster.
Mhm.
And that's where I was. I thought that if I gave a bad performance, I was a bad person.
Mhm.
And when I realized that that wasn't true, and that, and some of this too is, when you're young, you remember all your performances. You haven't had that many. Even if you've had 100 performances, you probably remember all 100 of them.
Mhm.
Um, but when you get 10 years in, you gain more perspective when you're
Yeah.
thinking in 5-year and 10-year chunks. So I think that some of that maybe is just sort of a natural progression of,
Mhm.
gaining experience.
Yeah. Or thinking that as a music major who's serious, like you need to be struggling, maybe. Uh,
Exactly. Yeah. And sometimes even if I wasn't struggling, I would fabricate a struggle for myself.
exactly. Yeah. I think sometimes when you're practicing, if you're like, well, that went great, it's like, well, you weren't looking for everything or something.
Exactly. Yeah. It's never as good or as bad as you thought it was. That's
Hmm.
that's that's been my experience. But the other thing is that when you tell yourself a story over and over again, that story becomes your reality.
Hmm.
So you have to be really careful of the story that you tell.
Hmm.
So when I changed my story, that changed everything for me.
Yeah. Is there advice that you hear yourself saying to your students just on repeat, that you think would be beneficial to others?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we just talked about, that really does form kind of the core of my teaching philosophy,
Okay.
is that the work is the work.
Hmm.
And I think it's important as a student to let go of your preferences, and like, you shouldn't be thinking about, well, I like this kind of music and I don't like that kind of music, because that immediately limits you. In fact, if anything, you should be trying to play the music that you don't like, or that you think that you don't like, to
Hmm.
find a way in that can make you a more complete artist.
Hmm.
um, but I'm very big on this core teaching that who you are is transcendent of what you do,
Hmm.
and that you have to keep that separate, and you have to protect yourself. You have to protect um, your internal world from what you do on the outside.
Hmm.
And then the other thing is that you have to set goals and be realistic and be reasonable. And like, if you want to play in the Chicago Symphony, then you need to practice more than everybody else.
Hmm.
Period. There's no other way. You're not going to be able to do that
Yeah.
without being. So you have to ask yourself, what do I want to do, and how hard am I willing to work?
Hmm.
And if those things, if you can't make your 5-year plan connect,
Yeah.
then you have to change one. You either have to change your goal, or you have to change the work that you're going to do to get there.
Hmm.
And I also tell my students that there's I think that a lot of times students think that they'll be they'll be disappointing their professor if they don't do a certain thing.
Okay.
And and I felt that too. I felt like, well, I felt like my jazz professor was going to be disappointed in me because I decided to be a saxophone professor and not a jazz professor.
Hmm.
And of course, that's completely not true at all. He's
Hmm.
thrilled for me that I'm having this great career. Um, but I tell my students that there is tremendous honor and importance in being a general music teacher in an elementary school.
Hmm.
And I'm just as proud of a student that does that as I am of, like Matt Stuver is a great example of somebody who, kind of followed my path, and until he diverged and became a bandmaster in the Navy band. Um, but I'm just as proud of those students that have gone on to do things that are non-musical. One of my first students at JMU is Jill Strager. Now she's Jill Kayer, and Jill teaches math. She teaches elementary school math, or middle school math,
Okay.
um, and I'm in touch with her all the time, and I'm super proud of her.
Yeah.
And we never talked about her being a math teacher when she was at JMU. I think that she minored in math, and she was interested in that. And her career just sort of winded through, and she ended up eventually teaching entirely math.
Have there been any detours in your interest or career since coming to JMU?
Yes. for sure. Probably the biggest thing that happened to me was I accidentally became I accidentally got back into visual art,
Mhm.
and it was completely by accident. I sitting in woodwind juries every semester, my hand would be like a brick by the end of day one, and having to do all that writing. So I thought, why don't I learn to write with my right hand so then I could switch off?
Mhm.
And the idea was not anything except, if I could just learn to write legibly with my right hand, that would be it'd be a cool party trick to be able to do. What I discovered is that it was no more difficult to learn to write beautifully
Mhm.
with your opposite hand than it is to write at all.
Yeah.
I started actually studying calligraphy.
Mhm.
I started like reading books and looking at things online, and I think my Instagram feed is probably like half music and half calligraphy, which is funny. But that got me back into drawing, and I loved to draw when I was a kid, and then once I started playing music, I just didn't have time for it,
Mhm.
and also like I didn't feel like my drawing was good enough, and so I stopped doing it because I was I was I'm not going to say that I was a perfectionist,
Yeah.
but I was careful about what I put out there to represent myself, and I thought my drawing wasn't good enough.
Mhm.
Um, so in the process of learning to draw to write and to draw with my right hand, I got into music calligraphy, and I
Mhm.
started studying old particularly Baroque manuscripts, and
Mhm.
I started copying Bach. I mean, that was really how I started getting into it, and that became a semi-professional thing for me, where people
Mhm.
started actually commissioning me to make manuscripts for them, which was great because I made just enough money to pay for paper and pens, and so I would do a project and I could get a new pen, with
Yeah.
that. But it also got me into drawing, and it got me into um, making more sort of graphic scores of my compositions, um, to the point that uh, I don't really use finale much anymore. I do almost all my writing by hand, and the reason that I do that is because I feel like I can get closer to what I'm trying to convey musically, visually, by drawing it. So I
Mhm.
really don't even think about writing music. I think about drawing music,
Okay.
and I do it with both of my hands, and and it's a cool party trick. But
Mhm.
it was also an experiment in practicing,
Mhm.
because I had also become really interested in the neuro science of practicing, and of course now we have fMRI, and so it's easier for us to see what's going on in the brain when people are playing, when they're improvising, or when they're composing. um, and the things that I had learned about how to be a good practicer, I thought, well, here's a great opportunity. So I started. So when I first started practicing writing, I was just trying to write, and it was a disaster.
Mhm.
So then I realized, looking at these handwriting manuals, oh, I just need to practice writing straight lines for a while. I need to practice writing ovals, connecting ovals, and then I would do like, maybe 10 minutes a day, I would practice writing one letter.
Yeah.
I would just, it was like a little kid, in school, with the practice sheet writing. Um, that became a major detour
Mhm.
in my career. And
Yeah.
now I'm kind of known for some of these graphic scores. And there's some of my pieces that I only sell as handmade scores. And I sell very few of them, obviously, but
Mhm.
it's not a there's not a huge market for avant-garde, extended technique saxophone music written by hand. Um, but it's been very rewarding, and it's made me think about music notation in a different way.
Mhm. That's very interesting. I went to your recital slash lecture, I guess, on your process.
Oh yeah.
And I think that it was clear to the audience that those two passions of yours have connected really well. And you can see it. I know when you had the music up on the screen, it's like as an audience member, you can kind of see how you are drawing like the music, I guess.
Yeah.
So that's really cool.
And it was totally accidental, it was just sort of exploring things that I was interested in,
Mm-hmm.
and they converged by accident.
Yeah.
Sometimes those things happen. I preach planning and being meticulous and knowing what your goals are.
Mm-hmm.
But you also have to listen to the universe. Sometimes it throws things at you that sometimes coincidences are meaningful.
I had an excellent time speaking with Professor Pope, and I think he's a great example of someone who has dealt with a lot of detours in his career and professional interests and really taken them and honed them in to be resources that actually help to propel his career and propel his interests and make him an even stronger musician. You can find the Detours in Music podcast on the Detours in Music podcast YouTube channel and on my website, laurarupeloboe.weebly.com. On the first of every month, we also have episodes that come onto Spotify and Apple Music podcast apps. And on social media, we also have the Detours in Music podcast Instagram. Thank you for listening, and I hope you tune in to the next episode.